So my name is Ann Discus. I'm here today as chair of the University Senate Diversity Committee. I'm also a member of the Philosophy Department and interim associate dean for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I want to welcome you all on this beautiful afternoon to the President's Symposium on Diversity. It's my honor to introduce the initiator and strong supporter of this event, President Susan Herbst. Susan Herbst became the 15th president of the University of Connecticut on June 1, 2011, and the university's first woman president, thereby significantly, and I hope irreversibly, diversifying the university's executive level population. Prior to joining the UConn community, President Herbst served as Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Academic Officer of the University System of Georgia, as Provost and Executive Vice President at SUNY Albany, and as Dean of Liberal Arts at Temple University. She ascended the faculty ranks to Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University and is the author of 4 books and many articles in the area of public opinion, media, and American politics. In her brief time at UConn, only 7 weeks short of her first anniversary, President Herbst has already had a profound impact in steering our university on an upward trajectory of enhanced academic excellence. And today we have the opportunity to think about the role of diversity in this upward trajectory. Please join me in welcoming President Herbst, who will provide opening remarks and introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks everybody for being here today. Great crowd as I hoped for. Significant work went into planning this event. We have Carol Workman, always at all of our events, doing a terrific professional job. And of course, Ann Discus. She was critical to this event and did a great job, as she always does. So thanks, Ann, for organizing us and keeping us on schedule. I know this is going to be an outstanding afternoon. In higher education, we talk a lot about diversity, hear a lot about diversity for institutions like ours, and all that rhetoric is great, but simply acknowledging the role diversity plays and talking about it isn't enough. It's not enough for us here at UConn. It has to be matched with really focused, strategic action so that we can do more than just envision our goals of diversity. We can actually take the concrete steps that we need to take to work to realize them. One of the great opportunities of the new faculty lines, the up to 300 new faculty lines that we're adding over the next 4 years, is to do the important work of diversifying faculty further. Some departments have done incredibly well, and we're proud of them, but a lot of work going forward. And the deans know that in their competition to get faculty lines, diversity is essential to how we'd like to see those hiring plans laid out. And honestly, can't approve many of them unless we know that diversity was highest priority. I delivered my first State of the University address last week, and I said that making us as diverse as possible as a campus should be a pillar, along with civility, that will help to build us as we go forward as an institution. We don't do badly right now in terms of the undergraduate population, which is vitally important to us. I was pleased to note last week when I gave that speech that this past fall, our incoming freshman class had 208% more minority students than the class that entered in 1995. So it's a lot of progress and gratifying to see UConn move in the right direction. But we have a long way to go with regard to the graduate student population and also the faculty and staff. Our diversity speaks to our most basic and cherished values as an institution of higher education, and embracing that enables the pursuit of real excellence, which is really the ultimate goal. The ultimate dependent variable is that diversity is what will get us there academically, intellectually. One of the reasons we can be excited about the event today is not me giving the introduction. It's having Lewis Gordon here, who's our keynote speaker, and then will join us for the panel. He is truly one of the most distinguished scholars on the subject of race in the nation today and has lectured throughout the world. He is the Laura H. Carnell Professor of Philosophy at Temple University with affiliations in African American Studies, Jewish Studies, and Religion. He's the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Thought and the Center for Afro-Jewish Studies at Temple. I'm proud to say that I lured him to Temple, and that's one of the best things I did in my entire professional life. I used to joke that hiring Louis was like hiring walking intellectual atmosphere. Students and faculty flocked to him immediately. I don't know how he got anything done in the past few years, given how many people, faculty and students, wanted to be in his orbit and wanted a piece of him, as we say. The depth and the breadth of his scholarship is remarkable, as are the numerous awards and honors that he's earned over the years. He's authored, co-authored, edited, co-edited scores of highly respected books, papers, and publications, and I urge you to look at some of those. A few are Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, Bannon and the Crisis of European Man, an essay on philosophy and the human sciences, and Her Majesty's Other Children, Sketches of Racism in a Neo-Colonial Age, which won the Gustavus Meyer Award for Outstanding Book on Human Rights in the United States. But much, much more. It'll take a long time for you to get through his incredible vita. Before joining Temple, he was a professor at Brown University for 8 years, during which the program in Afro-American Studies became the Department of Africana Studies under his leadership as chairperson. So founded the department, the first chairperson. He holds degrees from Lehman College in New York, from Brown, from Columbia, and received his PhD in philosophy from Yale. He's a highly sought-after speaker. I was impressed that Anna was able to schedule him here, and we're very lucky that they could join us today. So please, everybody, join me in welcoming Professor Louis Gordon.
Thank you, President Herbst, and thank all of you who are here today. Good afternoon, shalom, salam alaikum, and as they say in the islands, how you keepin'? And I hope you keep it fine. So, first, I'd like to thank Susan Herbst. This book I wrote called Disciplinary Decadence, in which in the beginning I lament that in the academy, there are too many higher administrators who are not highly accomplished scholars. And I said it would really make a difference if those administrators were also that. They'll have an understanding of the nuance of what we're trying to do as intellectuals, as academics. And that's a way of saying that with Susan Herbst, I'm very happy for UConn that you have both. Yes. It's funny, I met Jeffrey Akbar in Paris. We were on a plane that was hit by a tractor of all days. And we ended up being stuck in there for 24 hours. And on the way, I didn't know that President Herbst was coming here. And he just asked me, do you know Susan Herbst? What do you think of her? And I pretty much made the remarks I just made. And that, when you don't know these things, of course, you can put your foot in your mouth, right? And Akbar was, I think the same thing. And so it's one of those things where, as we were both speaking about it, I said, wow, you guys are very lucky. I'd also like to thank Dean Ann Hiskis for all she did, including the great conversations we had on the phone about ideas. That was just wonderful. I give a shout out also, not only to Jeffrey Akbar, but since this is being looked at some of the other campuses, to the students there. As well, I would also like to congratulate Willina Kimpson Price, whom, I met her at the University of Maryland, but as I see, she also received a Frederick G. Award, so congratulations. Where is she? And also to Karen Zajac, and also after this, Maria Luz Hernandez, who's going to moderate. So I begin. One of the things, there are a lot of things I want to talk to you about, but I'll begin first with basically a story of why I went to graduate school. And to get an idea of this, in the 80s, I was a high school teacher, and I was called into the principal's office. And the principal said, we need to talk to you about the attendance of your students. So I said, well, whatever you're trying. And then he interrupted me and he said, no, you don't understand. An excellent New York City high school teacher has 60% attendance. And he said, you have 98% attendance. So the superintendent would like you to create a special program for kids nobody else wants to teach, right? And he said these kids are so difficult that if but 10% of them get through the program, that's a successful program. Well, the program I ended up creating was a second chance program, and we had 85% success rate, and the program still exists. And when you do this, you're asked to write a study of this program, right? And of course, when you sit down and write a study, there are all kinds of things you're trying to do. But then I began to realize that there was something that I couldn't put into this study because I didn't even know how to articulate it. How do you really study this? Okay? And what do you think that may have been? Well, the missing ingredient, so to speak, was the fact that we related to the students as human beings. Okay? How do you operationalize the question of treating each other as human beings? And it struck me as something very, very odd, because as you know, everybody here knows she or he is a human being. But if you're not treated like a human being, you begin to deteriorate. And when you're treated like a human being, you grow. And so for me, that was a very interesting question. It was a question of potentiality, right? What it is to deal with human potential. But of course, even though I mentioned this, and even though I just told you about this, you still don't know why the program was so successful. Because again, for you, simply knowing what a human being is doesn't seem to answer everything. Well, I'll tell you one of the things we did. One of the things I did in that program was I insisted that on the first day when 75 of those students were assembled, when we got together, we assembled in an empty room. There wasn't anything, it was just white walls, there wasn't even a painting, nothing in the room. And when we got together, we had a conversation. And we had a conversation on something that I think everyone in this room should have had a conversation on, but my guess is very few have. And for the past 25 years, I've talked about this all across the globe. And everywhere I've been, only twice I've met somebody who has had a conversation on this. And the topic for the conversation was, what is a school? Isn't it remarkable? I'm curious, how many of you in this room have had that conversation? Can you raise your hand? Look at that, 1. Okay, 2. Most of you, including the professors, all of us, have spent most of our lives in schools. And we haven't had a conversation about what a school is. And you can imagine the conversation those high school kids had, right? One of them, well, school's a place I don't want to be. But as we went on, I pointed out, I said, well, I have some thoughts on what a school is. I said, the word school is from the word scole. And the word scole in antiquity means leisure time. Can you imagine telling a group of high school kids, leisure time? But I explained that the idea was that we the human animal, we have to devote so much, what all other animals have to do is devote so much time to security, to shelter, to food, that they don't have leisure time. But we have found a way to get the things we need that those things free us to devote our time to human things. And that what school is about is a devotion to your humanization. And at that point, they're like, oh. And they began to think through. They said, well, it was about our humanization. Why are we in an empty room? And we said, well, how do we build it? And as we began to talk through, we began to talk through how do you decorate the room. We began to talk through the things you should learn. And in the process, you learn a valuable thing, and that is, it is very important to know why you do what you do. The reason they were doing very well is because they understood that. In fact, it makes sense if you're going to be organizing around diversity to start right away with the question of why. Right? Otherwise, people are just following you blindly into a direction, and they don't understand it, they won't do it well, they may be alienated. It's very important to know why you do what you do. And in fact, I don't teach any subject matter without a conversation that begins with why. Why are you here? Why do you study it? Why do you do math? Why do you do history? And in fact, when you think about it, these human activities go all the way through from the natural sciences That's what we do. We think, we create. And now, I move to a metaphor. Because if we begin there, and we're going to talk about thinking, we're going to talk about the various ways in which we actually produce ideas. Now, when we think about knowledge, we're in a university, it's a place where you pursue knowledge. There are many metaphors you could use for it. One metaphor is you could imagine if you entered an empty room. A dark room. And when you come into a dark room, you don't know what's in the room, so you light a match. And if you light a match, you can see a little bit. And you may find a candle, and you see a little more. And eventually you might find a light switch, and when you turn it on, you can see a lot of what's in the room. And that's the metaphor of knowledge as a ray of light. But there's another metaphor. There's another metaphor, as we know, the Big Bang Theory. I know it's a popular television show. But if you think about the Big Bang idea, the idea that there's an expansion of knowledge. And as knowledge expands, it also creates things. So you have these two poles. You have the knowledge about what is already there, and you have the knowledge about what you're going to create. And I bring this up because a false dilemma is presented when we talk about everything from diversity to knowledge. And the false dilemma is that you must have one versus the other. There's a lot of this out there, right? This versus that, right? And quite often, we get into all of this tiff over things where we can, in fact, have both. There could be more than one way to do things, and there could be many forms of projects involved. Now, some of the things I'm going to talk about also connect to the kind of work I do. Because my work deals with issues of human evasion. As you could see, I went to graduate school to study around the question of human potential because I saw the consequences of human evasion. I'm going to talk about disciplinary decadence. And of course, if I'm going to talk about disciplinary decadence, I should talk about what it is to transcend that kind of decadence. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that to transcend it involves building communities of living research and thought. Now, this all could be translated into three kinds of questions. One of them, especially my work I ask, is, what are we? The other one is, what shall we do? And the third is, how do we justify our thinking, our activities, even justification itself? Okay? And I'm hoping that it'll be clear as I bring a lot of these together to bear on the question of diversity. Now, I saw something that really, really connected to this issue the other day. Did any of you see the President's White House Forum on Women in the Economy? Did any of you listen to that speech? It's a great speech. And one of the things I liked about it is that the President touched on many themes that are going to be in the symposium. He talked about the injustice of unequal distribution of access and compensation, and he talked about the impact of that on society. In other words, one of the things that happen when many people are not able to present their abilities, their talents, is that ultimately everyone suffers. Okay? So the President brought those two to bear. Okay? And if you think about the question of tapping into human potential, you could see it connected, in fact, to what Ann Eskis did when she introduced the president. You have the first woman president of this university, and you have a situation that now signals that there's not a glass ceiling in this university in terms of its highest post. Now, as we continue around this question, we begin to see something that I argue in all of my writings. Although we say diversity, many people are thinking race. And then, you know, what happens? A lot of times when you go somewhere, you bring up race, people say, well, isn't it really about class? And if you talk about class, some people say, well, what about gender? And then you bring up gender, class, where you say, hey, what about sexual orientation? Now, you know, one of the things that's really hokey about this, of course, is I don't know about the rest of you, but, you know, never, ever, ever have I seen only a race walking around. Or have I ever seen only a gender walking around? Or a sexual orientation, or a class? And this tells you something. Because it's a distorted way of looking at human beings. Human beings are a complex interaction of all of these things. And so it's a false dilemma to say that somehow one of them has to rule exclusively over the other. There's just no way for you to walk in the room that way. And it's funny because some people are going to take the position that what you should do is to say, well, it's about being an individual. But again, I don't think any anybody in this room has ever been discriminated against as an individual. As we begin to understand this, we begin to understand that we have to deal with some of the more uncomfortable dimensions of how these things fit together, okay? Now, when we begin to think about this, okay, we begin to see how all of these things, the very question of what the human being is, connects even to other themes, even to the question of freedom. And some of these lead to situations that are sometimes overdetermined situations when we try to examine them. If you say, for instance, diversity, some people get very defensive because they immediately collapse into an accusatory role, right? You're raising the question of diversity because someone has done something wrong. But of course, these things can lead to very strange developments. And I can illustrate it through a little story. There's a story that took place in the island of Trinidad. It was during the period of colonialism. And during that period of colonialism, an Anglican minister came to the island. He wanted to make sure that the children were getting a very good colonial education. So as he marched in, and you know this is what happened, there was a boy who was late to school. And as a little boy who was running in to come, the minister stopped him. And he said, "Young man, could you tell me who knocked down the wall of Jericho?" And you could imagine this poor little boy, and he looked, and he knew what to say. He said, "Well, sir, not me." Now, you can imagine, right? The minister is outraged. So he takes the boy to his teacher. Let's call him Mr. Smith. And you can imagine poor Mr. Smith. You know what I mean? Here he is, went through the colonial schools, probably had a lot of canings, you know, got his way through, got his degree, finally it earned him his glasses, you know. And he gets there, and he sees this poor old boy come in, and there is this minister with him, and he said, "Are you Mr. Smith?" He says, "Yes, I am, sir." He said, "Well, I just asked this boy who knocked down the wall of Jericho, and you know what he told me?" "What did he tell you, sir?" He said, "He didn't do it." You see the little boy is a little afraid. The teacher, and he looks at the little boy, he looks at the minister, and he takes off his glasses, and he says, "Well, sir, I've known this boy a long time, and if he said he didn't do it, he didn't do it." Well, of course, we're already in the first point about this complexity of communication, right? And one of the things in a lot of my work I look at is the complex way, and this is something we all know, is that we human beings have the ability to lie to ourselves. And especially when we are dealing with situations in which the lies, they're not even always pernicious, but they're connected to situations, complex things. What's even more complicated in philosophical terms is that lying to ourselves, we could call it bad faith, is something we actually have to be capable of as human beings. If it were impossible for us to tell lies, if it were impossible for us to try to evade our freedom, paradoxically, we wouldn't be free. We're actually free to attempt not to be free. And these paradoxes of what it is to be a human being play themselves out in a lot of situations. They play themselves out in ethical terms. They play themselves out in political terms. There's a lot of that. I mean, wow. Wow. If you listen to some of the debates that are happening right now, especially around political terms, they're absolutely absurd. Because they're actually premised upon things that make absolutely no sense. All right? You hear, for instance, the conversation, all right? We need the private sector to grow jobs. Makes absolutely no kind of sense. But we say this. If you're in the private sector, you want profits. If it means hiring as few people as possible, that's how you do it. But we've committed ourselves as a nation to say that the public sector, public universities, public institutions, should not be in that business. But again, part of being public is to have the capacity to respond to social needs. So if you say those who could respond to social needs must not, and those whose purpose isn't to respond to social needs should be the ones doing it, you have a perfect story. These are some of the contradictory ways in which we do these things, and we do them epistemologically as well. We do it at the level of how we produce knowledge. Because again, if we set up as a condition of knowledge, that somehow the knowledge must be understood outside of its relationship to other forms of knowledge, then you're going to set up as a model of knowledge that knowledge functions like that of a God. And we do this in institutional terms. We try to get our institutions often to help us in the many ways in which we attempt to lie to ourselves, to evade ourselves, to not deal with the very questions at hand and how we should organize our institutions. Okay? And among the lies we use institutionally is through the construction of what we could call problem people. Now, to give you an idea of what problem people is about, you could imagine, for instance, if you go back to 1945, Jean-Paul Sartre, famous French philosopher, came to the United States. And Jean-Paul Sartre loved black music, he loved jazz, he loved all of that stuff. Well, he was Sartre, he also liked a lot of weed, but that's another matter. But Sartre hooked up with Richard Wright, and Richard Wright knew exactly what to do. He took Jean-Paul Sartre to Harlem. And you can imagine Jean-Paul Sartre in Harlem hanging out with Richard Wright. You know, and as he's walking around, he said, "Richard, could you tell me about the black problem?" And Richard Wright turned around and he said, "Black problem?" He says, "There's no black problem in America." He said, "There's a white problem." And at that point, Sartre said, "Oh wow," he realized, and he went back to France and he said, "Yeah, it's not a Jewish problem in Europe, it's the anti-Semites problem." But of course, this problem is the problem of making people into problems. It's a problem that goes all the way back to some of the ideas in W.B. Du Bois, in Anna Julia Cooper. In fact, some of the things we're saying about diversity. Anna Julia Cooper in an essay called "What Are We Worth?" Right? She argued that you're worth a lot if very little is invested into you, but you give back more. If a lot is invested into you and you give back even more, you're worth more. And one of the big problems in the world today is we've made it lopsided. We're investing a lot in places that give back very little. That was her critique. And Du Bois, when he was looking at problems, he noticed if you raise the question of people of color, if you raise the question of the problem people, it was through a tendency to make them into problems instead of looking at the problems they face. And if you make them into problems, it means you're turned away from reality. You're not looking at the social forces and institutions, the things the society does that actually produces problem people. Those young people I met in that program were problem children. That relationship to them of not making them into problems enabled them to grow. And if we're thinking about what it is when we build our institutions, any program we set up, we must raise the question of how the very institutions, the options we have in society, play a role in the very production of the problems we may have. In an odd way, W.B. Du Bois, there's a bit of a funny story around W.B. Du Bois on this, because W.B. Du Bois, if you all talk about an issue of diversity, I mean, W.B. Du Bois, first graduate there at Harvard, he went on, he went to Germany, he studied for the doctor so, he got his PhD at Harvard in history. He wrote the inaugural book around the question of the transatlantic slave trade for the Harvard History Series. He went on, he went to Philadelphia, he did the mammoth tome, The Philadelphia Negro, that completely transformed the very question of how one does empirical sociology, and he even went to look at the theoretical questions around which you do sociology, and the University of Pennsylvania did not hire him. The characters, which in the book, by the way, were of color, turned out to be played by people of color. But the idea that children were saying they didn't feel sad now that they saw them as black, that they died. All right? So that, we know that is there. But now the question comes in a very different way. The other problem is this: if I'm correct, that the very premise of it was in bad faith. Now we have the fundamental problem of affirmative action. The problem of affirmative action in the United States of America is that it works. Really think about that. When it was actually a commitment to it, it began to make a difference. And it was because it was working that it was in effect eradicated. There really isn't affirmative action in the United States of America. Now, one of the things about it is if there isn't affirmative action, why is there such an attachment to something that in fact has had the teeth taken entirely out of it. Well, of course, the problem that happens with it is because of another lie in our country. And here's the lie. The lie in our country is an appeal to a mythic time in which the standards were high and things were just. What if I went and studied a lot of institutions, and you know when they created their standards? When affirmative action was introduced. Because they now have to account for why they were excluding people. You see what I'm getting at? It was actually easier in the past. There are people who just got on the phone and said, "Hi, my friend." You see? But now, once women began to come in, once people of color began to come in, mythical standards began to emerge. And the standards are also premised upon a lie. I'll give you an example. I was in South Africa last year, and somebody was going on against affirmative action now in South Africa, South Africa. Where, you know what black unemployment is in South Africa? 80%. But whites in South Africa would tell you, you'll be black, right? But the thing that was extraordinary as they went on and on, I finally said, is every white person in South Africa extraordinary and excellent? And here's the point, right? For institutions to function, you don't actually need the best. You just need people good enough. But the truth is, within those communities, there are people who have a unique passion for their work and are the best. And those come across racial lines. But the myth of these standards lead to this situation. When I wrote a piece called The Problem with Affirmative Action for Truth Out, which is the thesis, it works. I had a flood of letters from people all telling me the same story. They were from women, they were from East Indians, from African Americans, from Latinos who said they finally got the job, they got in, they're the only one, and they looked around them, and you know what they said? They're shocked at the level of mediocrity around them. Because they realized that the standards were inflated, and they tried to meet a standard that their colleagues did not have to meet. So the truth about affirmative action, it was hijacked because the discourse is added a call underqualification. But that's a narcissistic discourse. It's to convince those who already have the system that they were the ones highly qualified. The truth about affirmative action is that it raises the standards. It's because you have affirmative action that people have to be accountable. People have to show what they could do. People have to produce more. Everybody in this room could tell you that the academy today is wanting people have to publish more, publish an article, just do far more than people had to do 25, 30 years ago. And so once we understand that affirmative action actually raises standards, then we get to the other point. So why would some people want to cling to the notion that they're preventing things? Well, it's connected to their narcissism. Because deep down, they actually need the other affirmative action discourse of underqualified people to convince themselves that they're the superior and more qualified. And so once we get into these discourses, there's a lot of social pressure on other people. And I think it's important for those of us who do this kind of work to go to the next level, which is, I don't think we should work on people's, I don't think it works at the level of trying to deal with how individually bad people are. If you set up a diversity and stuff as if it's a kind of therapy for your ethical life, I think it's patronizing and doesn't work. I think what's much better is that point I made about institutions. If we, what was good about affirmative action is that it was an institutional response. You see, if we build institutions, categories, areas of meetings where communities get together, what other people would say is not, well, you know, I'm not a racist. I think, are you a racist? Are you not a racist? Discourse doesn't really work here. I think what's different is to get people to say, you know, that's really interesting. I want a piece of that. And I think there are ways in which people get involved in that, where you begin to develop communities of relationships where people begin to learn more. Yes, your name?
Hi, I'm going to be the last question, okay?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Cheryl. I'm a senior sociology major. Last year, I too had the opportunity to study abroad in South Africa. And while I was there, I read the writings of a man named Steve Biko. And one of the quotes that stuck out to me the most was, "The greatest weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." And through that saying and through his writings, he was advocating that black people needed to know who they were, the beauty of who they were before they could succeed in the outside world. So kind of succeed outside of their own world. So what does the inclusion of diversity, how does the inclusion of diversity within a curriculum, both in high school and college, how does that affect the success of students who are maybe of a different race or who are women or of different sexuality? So how does the inclusion of their history affect their success? Because many times, being of Caribbean American ancestry, being from Trinidad, you always see negative images, mostly of who we are as a Black woman on TV. So how does promoting a more positive image in curriculum affect not only the press group, but those of the dominant group as well?
Thank you for the question. I actually wrote the foreword to Pico's I Write What I Like. I have a very, very strong relationship to Pico in terms of not only his work, but the work I do in South Africa. But I think I can answer your question, since we don't have much time, through a very short example. About 8 years ago, I was on MSNBC debating the question of Black studies. And my opponent said we shouldn't have Black studies in the academy because, and here was his response, he said, it makes people angry. And you could imagine me, right? What's wrong with that? Because as we know, there's anger and there's healthy heuristic learning anger. Now, why does it make people angry? Well, you see, what this person was missing is this. Those of us who have taught in Black studies or taught in ethnic studies or taught in women's studies, we could call those the post-European sciences. If you teach in those areas, there's something fascinating. If you think about what it is to be the dominant or the mainstream, it's like being a god. It means you don't have to look elsewhere. So you imagine yourself outside of relation to everyone else, right? The problem is there is an outside. So in effect, you're a false reality. You consider yourself universal when you're particular. Now let's look at those on the outside. There's no way you're Black except in relation to people who are brown, white, or any other. No way you're a woman except in relation to a man, that sort of thing. So because you're always in a relation to something, to account for you, you have to account for the other. So your world isn't this narrow thing as a universal, it is a broader world. And so once you begin to understand this, you begin to get to the next move. And I call it, my wife Jane Gordon and I call it pedagogical imperative. And what a pedagogical imperative is that anyone who teaches, right, to remember what it is to be a student. Which it means that when you're teaching, what all a researcher, all a professor is a person who continues to be in love with learning. And so you continue to research, you get to know more, which means it's an obligation to understand that your discipline, that point I made about disciplinary decadence, is not the world. And that continual learning makes you see more. So what happens is when students come to Black studies and they'll say they look at American history, they know what the standard canon American history is. But what as the boys all the way to Professor Unbar here knows, is that the actual American history is much broader than that. And in knowing those other relations, you find out you have an entire different meaning to understanding who you are as a nation. And at that moment, you begin to learn. If you come to college for an education, not simply a degree, you want to know those things. And so the anger is, why wasn't I learning that elsewhere? You see, everybody should be doing it. You know, you learn that Columbus came because he was interested in exploration. What you don't know is that there was a war called the Reconquest, and that it was to knock out Afro-Muslims and Afro-Jews in Iberia. And that led to the Inquisition. And as they were locking those people out, the reason it's called the Reconquest is because it's not part of the understanding of Christianity that it was ever conquered, even though that was 800 years of colonization. And then, if you look at it in that way, and that conflict continued through the Crusades and other places, you realize that Columbus's voyage was also a reconnaissance mission. And then you also understand what it is to have the Mediterranean collapse into an 800-year economic depression. If you see what we deal with a recession, you can imagine 800-year economic depression, and thus opening up the Atlantic changed trade, but it changed trade, which changed relations, you have to use knowledge, all kinds of things. So one of the things you could learn if you look at Columbus in that way is you learn that as you change relationships, not only do you change, but they also change the world. And so building these new kinds of relationships, that is actually a better way to deal with the question of not only knowledge, which you're to learn, but it also deals with something very important because you understand yourself. You understand yourself as being connected to history, not as a passive object, but also as an agent. That's my answer.
So we're going to invite the panelists at this time. Okay. I'm going to introduce Dr. Purkayastha, who is the panel moderator. So Vandana Purkayastha is a professor of sociology and Asian American studies and interim head of sociology at the University of Connecticut. She has published extensively on racism, gendering, class formation processes, and human rights, with a special focus with highly educated racial and religious minorities, immigrants, and their children. She has worked on diversity and social justice issues in the community, and her work has been recognized by the Connecticut legislature. Within the university, she has worked to improve the recruitment and retention of faculty and graduate students of color. She served on the 2002 Board of Trustees Commission on Diversity at the University of Connecticut and on several other university initiatives on diversity. She has also been involved within the state sister-to-sister network of sociologists for women in society to help transform the discipline. She holds several international and national elected positions within sociology and is president-elect of Sociologists for Women in Society.
Thank you, Dr. Panelist. So even that brief introduction to what I'm doing right now draws a direct line to what Dr. Lewis Gordon just said. If we, myself, all the sociologists I see in the audience, are still struggling to transform the discipline, you know that there is a straight line drawn from Du Bois being the father of the discipline to where we're trying to get at now. But this very meaningful program in the afternoon today was meant to be a conversation, and it's my absolute honor to be moderating a discussion from this point onwards. We have a very distinguished panel, all of whom will be answering in real brief terms one simple question, and that is, what challenges do you see facing UConn's commitment to achieving excellence through diversity at the institutional level? And our hope is, after our panelists have just addressed that question very briefly, it'll be a conversation amongst all of us on this side of the tables and everybody else who's facing us. So with that, let me introduce the panelists. On the right of Dr. Gordon, you have Hedley Freak, who has been at the University of Connecticut since 1988. And Professor Freak is in the Department of Nutritional Sciences. He served the university in many capacities, and I know many of you in the room have worked with him in those capacities. He has definitely chaired the Senate Executive Committee and the General Education Oversight Committee. The GEOC rules that we all follow have been ushered through those processes. He's Program Director of Strong Connecticut, an NSF-funded collaboration with local community colleges aimed at promoting the success of underrepresented students in science. He spent 2009 and 10 in Hong Kong as a Fulbright scholar, advising universities on the development of general education programs. To the right of him is Colin Neary. I know the name tag says Sam Tracy. Sam actually had some health problems, so Colin has graciously offered to step in. And Colin Neary, class of 2012, is a senior senator of the undergraduate student government. As a member and former chairperson for the Multicultural and Diversity Committee in this undergraduate student government, he's focused on outreach to increase and publicize the diversity of the student body. Colin, we're particularly grateful to you for stepping in at the last moment. Next to Colin is Dean Salome Rahim. And she's the Dean of the School of Social Work and, of course, a professor at the University of Connecticut. She is also the co-chair of the Provost Commission on Institutional Diversity. As a scholar, her research interests include cultural competence, social justice, and social and economic development. Her passion for creating more just organizations and communities has taken her across the United States and to 4 continents to provide training and consultation to schools, universities, human services organizations, and businesses on how to create welcoming, inclusive, and equitable environments. She earned a Bachelor of Social Work degree from Bowie State University, a historical Black institution, a Master's in Social Work from the Catholic University of America, and a PhD in Communication Studies from the University of Iowa. Next to Dean Rahim is Jorge Santos, who is a 4th-year PhD candidate at the University of Connecticut's English Literature Department. He's from Houston, Texas, and he's currently drafting his dissertation, which explores the relationship between religious identity and race in 20th century American multi-ethnic literature. He is also an assistant director for the University Writing Center, where he actively recruits candidates from diverse backgrounds and leads staff discussions on the specific needs for tutoring naturalized and international ELL students. Next to Jorge is Kathleen Holgerson, who's been the leader of the Women's Center since for a very long time. Sorry to say from 1994. Okay, from 1994. In 1994, she was actually hired as a program coordinator for the Violence Against Women Prevention Program, and she's also an alumni of this university. She in fact volunteered at the Women's Center as an undergraduate student, and I think there are lots of graduate students and undergraduate students in the audience who came through a similar route. At least I can see a few faces here who followed Kathleen. Kathleen Holgerson has worked on a variety of university initiatives, including the Mentoring Task Force, the Provost Commission on the Status of Women, the Working Group for the university's NSF Advanced IT Proposal, is the grant proposal, and the co-chair of the Planning Committee for the University Metanoia on Preventing Violence Against Women. In addition to her university service, Kathleen currently serves on the Anti-Racism/White Privilege Working Group of the National Women's Studies Association Women's Centers Committees. So with that, a very, very, very brief introduction to our panelists. And I won't stand in the way of the panelists, starting off the conversation. I will just, sort of stand here and ask, point out to people as they ask questions. So with that, if Professor Heppy, please could start.
Thank you, Madam. And thanks to the organizers and to the President for giving me the opportunity to say a few words here this afternoon. Since we're all being strictly limited to 5 minutes, I'm going to read my comments to make sure I get my words in the right order. Racism is an active force at the University of Connecticut. That may be a shocking statement for some of you, because for the most part, we do our best to behave well around each other. We don't like crosses or daub swastikas. But racism is endemic in our society, and it is not possible to grow up here, or in my case in England, without being contaminated by it. We've recently been transfixed by the happenings in Sanford, Florida, where it seems that a young black man would still be alive today if he was a young white man. We can be outraged by racism elsewhere, but less willing to confront it closer to home and within ourselves. We live in a state with the largest educational achievement gap in the country. I grew up poor in a working class family, and I understand the influences of class and poverty, but race adds another dimension. None of us have escaped the effects of racism. I first became involved in anti-racism work 40 years ago based on my belief in justice. It just did not seem fair that humans should be treated differently based on their skin color or gender or other arbitrary characteristics. Justice and equal opportunity remain ideals, but over the years I've begun to pay more and more attention to the ways in which racism affects white people. I recognize the existence of white privilege, the fact that people looking like me do not have to be concerned about being suspected for shoplifting, or being stopped by the police as we drive about our normal business. People don't worry about whether my position at UConn is a result of an affirmative action program. However, that privilege comes at a cost. Our failure to extend those privileges to all members of the global community curtails our own humanity. We read Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, in one of my classes here this semester. It's blatantly and simplistically racist, reflecting the thinking of the time about the superiority of the white European Christian culture. However, I reinterpret that phrase to suggest that white men do indeed have a burden, not from the responsibilities of civilizing the colonies, but rather from our functional limitations that result from the acceptance of racism. One of the very wealthy and privileged presidential candidates has repeatedly put his foot in his mouth when trying to connect with ordinary working people. His comments about Cadillacs and NASCAR serve to demonstrate his limited understanding of the world and emphasize the separation experienced by people from his class background. These kinds of missteps happen frequently when white people make efforts to communicate with the global majority. None of us asked to be racist, and many feel bad about our own missteps in this area or those of others. This in part explains our reluctance to acknowledge racism and our denial of the necessity for affirmative action. But racism does influence our thinking and actions. It leaves us with partial understanding of the world and smaller lives. One of the standard arguments for diversity embraced by academia and business alike is that collective thinking is improved when a variety of perspectives are included. I teach a seminar class for incoming graduate students in nutritional sciences. And there is no doubt that the quality of discussion in that classroom is enhanced by the presence of women and men from different parts of the world and with varied backgrounds. But being in that classroom also influences me. The quality of my thinking and my understanding of the world is enhanced by interaction with a variety of people and ideas different from my own. A diverse campus within which all members are heard and valued not only improves the collective outcomes, but also the functioning of each individual. Our ability to pursue our academic goals in a creative and meaningful way is strengthened. Finally, a word or two about excellence. I think that an institution should be judged on the basis of the quality of its graduates, even if there is no standardized test that is up to the job. I'm interested in the contributions our graduates make to the societies they inhabit after they leave here. We need to give them superb disciplinary training in their chosen fields, but also the ability to solve complex problems that require integration across many fields. I would like our graduates to have an enhanced understanding of the world and the position of the United States within it. I also want our graduates to have rich and fulfilling lives. These goals cannot be met without diversity of students, faculty, staff, and ideas. Thank you.
So, before having a conversation about diversity and excellence, I want to discuss what exactly the concept means and the potentiated double consciousness that Dr. Gordon put so beautifully. So the Multicultural and Diversity Committee that I've served on for the past 2 semesters has defined its role as an active committee in deconstructing stereotypes that are used to alienate individuals within the university committee. We define diversity as an inclusive environment and culture where students, faculty, and staff from all ethnic, religious, socioeconomic, gender, sexual orientation, age, military service, ideological, and political backgrounds are accepted. I was removed from my chairpersonship in the first semester for my adamant dedication to planning events that were connected with the socioeconomic commentary of the Occupy movement. And I disconnected from the leadership of the student government in my dedication also to the idea that politics is innate in a discussion of diversity, and no progress has been made for multiculturalism that hasn't been determined in courtrooms or on streets. Yet I was told by the leadership of the undergraduate student government that politics had no place in my committee, and so, thus, I was seen unfit for the job. And I think this underlines the fact that in America, we really haven't come very far in connecting diversity and excellence. One must look no further than Sanford, Florida, or the dismantling of affirmative action programs over the past 2 decades. But the root of my conversation today is actually to acknowledge the ethnic group that is not present on this panel today, and that would be the Native Americans whose indigenous land we stand on this very day.